Hello friends. So I welcome you again on our YouTube channel Etax Helpline. And today's point of discussion is the interpretation of statutes. As we all know, there are various interpretation of statutes, and in today's webinar we are only going to discuss the literal rule of interpretation. As a practicing legal practitioner, either you are dealing in corporate law, taxation law, or in civil and criminal law, or in any other laws, we need to understand one thing, that law is not a simplified subject. It's a very complicated subject, and we need to understand the language of the law, the purpose behind the enactment of the law. So various rules have been framed for the interpretation of the legal language, and the first rule is the literal rule. So we used to call it the literal rule of interpretation. The literal rule of interpretation means the term interpretation has been derived from the Latin language, which means to explain or understood. Every statutes have to be interpreted by the judges the way it has been understood. There can be a situation that a law has been drafted with such a simplified language that you can interpret it with the literal rule only. However, there can be a situation that the language of law is very difficult or complicated, or that we have to see the purpose behind the enactment of the law, what were the objects mentioned on the preamble of the law, and also we have to see what is the essence of the law. So today's webinar will be technically focused on the literal rule. The purpose of interpretation is always to find out what the statute stands for, what is the defect in intend to remove, and what is the remedy to seek the advance. So the basic purpose of the construction of statutes is that the words have to be read and understood in their true literal sense. The literal rule is the first rule applied by the judges, and it is a general principle also, that firstly we have to read the law, we have to understand the language, the meaning of that law, and in case that language is you can say misleading, then we have to shift to other rules of the interpretation. So the literal rule is sometimes in some courts or in some countries, people used to call it grammatical rule also, because we have to read the language of the law in a grammatical manner. So the literal rule means that the judges has to consider what the statute says literally, that is the simple plain meaning, without any ambiguity, without any further interpretation, without any other words themselves before adding, before that statute, after that statute, essence of the statute. We have to skip that part and we have to read the language of the law only literally. Also, I request you all, if you have any query on the literal rule, you can please post during the webinar and I will try to reply the queries. So the interpretation or construction means the process by which the court seeks the court seeks to ascertain the intent of the legislature through the medium of authoritative form. So in the literal rule of interpretation, the law has to be considered as it is. The literal interpretation is the meaning to ascertain the ratio legis of the statute. There are various judgments under which literal rule have been explained, and in a very famous English judgment in Able and Gale, it has been interpreted that where the meaning of the statutory words is plain and unambiguous, it is not then of the judges to invent fancied ambiguities as to excuse for failing to give effect to its plain meaning, because they consider the consequences for doing so much be inexplicit or even unjust or immoral. So we can clearly say in a simple words that if the plain meaning of the law, if the plain reading of the law itself is sufficient, then we should not go into any ifs and buts. We just read the law as it is, interpret it, and then accordingly apply it. No judge can deviate from the meaning of the statute through decisions may be unjust. The words of the statute must be prima facie be given giving their ordinary meaning. So the literal rule accepts supremacy of the parliament, supremacy of the law, the right to make law, even though sometimes they seems absurd. In the literal rule of interpretation, there is no contrary meaning within the statute. It's very simple. Read the law and interpret it. No ambiguity there. So where the language of the statute is clear and unambiguous, it is not necessary to look into the legislature intent or objects of the act. The literal rule puts a virtual boundary upon the judges from not deviating from the ordinary or literal meaning of the words used in the statutes. So friends, this is the plain meaning of literal rule of interpretation. Now let's see few judgments which explains the literal rule and or which are exceptions to the literal rule. But before understanding the judgments exception to the literal rule, we firstly should understand what is Heyden'S rules. So there was a very famous English judgment. There is a ruling of Heyden'S case in 1584 in England. And what is that ruling says? It says that first use the mischief rule for it is the first case where mischief rule for interpretation of statutes was used. According to this ruling, while interpreting statutes, first the problem or mischief that the statute was designed to remedy should be identified, and the construction that suppresses the problem and advances the remedy should be adopted. However, this rule of construction is of narrower application than the golden rule or the plain meaning rule, as it can be used to interpret a statute, and strictly speaking only when the statute was passed to remedy a defect in the common law. So what Heyden rule case judgment says, what Heyden case law says, it clearly says that while reading a case law, while reading a statute which has been passed by the parliament, we must see what was the earlier statute, what was the defect in the earlier statute, why this act has been enacted, what has been specified during the enactment of this act, what is the object behind the enactment of this act. So this Heyden case is is above the literal rule but below the golden rule. Some people used to call it mischief rule also. It is in between literal interpretation and golden interpretation. So second interpretation is golden interpretation. So anything between literal interpretation and golden interpretation is called mischief interpretation or the Heyden case law. So this case law was a very landmark judgment which is not giving a second, which is not going to give a second meaning to the language of the law, but it only it in addition to the language of the law also focuses on the preamble of the law, the purpose behind the enactment of the law, what was the earlier law, what was the defect in that law, and which defect have been removed, and what is the preamble and object of this law. So all these things need to be considered while interpreting the law. So this is the Heyden'S case, this was the Heyden'S case, this was the Heyden'S rule. So now we are going to discuss few exceptional cases, and our main focus will be on the income tax cases or the taxation cases. Or so these are the cases where courts took a stand and they bypass the rule of literal interpretation. So these are the exceptions to the literal interpretation, but in these cases Heyden rule or the golden rule or the other rules have been applied by the courts. What is the first judgment? It's a very landmark income tax judgment in the case of Sadra Devi. In 1957, This is the old income tax law. Since current income tax law came in 1961, this judgment came for the old income tax law, which was enacted in 1922 and which was till 1961, before the current income tax law was enacted. So the Supreme Court in Sadra Devi case expressed the view that the rule of Heyden'S case is applicable only when the words in question are ambiguous and are reasonably capable of more than one meaning. You know, when the language of the law gives more than one meaning, then we have to shift from the literal rule to some other rule. So in this case, it has been clearly said that Heyden rule can be applied, means the applicability of Heyden rule is in a situation when the plain reading of the law gives more than one meaning and we are not able to conclude the facts within the law. The judgment quoted the ruling of High Court, which says that the High Court plugged heading into a discussion of the reason which motivates the legislature into enacting section 16(3) of the Income Tax Act 1922 and took into consideration the recommendations made in the Income Tax Inquiry Report 1936 and also the statement of objects and reasons for the enactment of the same, without considering the first instance where there was an ambiguity in the word individual as used therein. So there was a clear-cut confusion on the use of word individual, and for that the Heyden principle was applied instead of literal interpretation. Also, in a second ruling for the old income tax time, also in Kanailal Sur versus Parminidhi Sukumaran, what was in that case? Court states that the recourse to object and policy of the act or consideration of the mischief and effect which the act purports to remedy is only permissible when the language is capable of two construction. So here also court clearly says that when the literal interpretation gives more than one meaning, then and there only we have to shift to Heyden's rule. However, it is submitted that for deciding whether the language used by the legislature is plain or ambiguous, it has to be studied in the context, and the context embraces previous state of the law and the mischief with the statute intended to be remedied. So as we have already discussed that we have to see what was the earlier law, what was the loophole, what was the loophole, what was the lacuna in the earlier law, and how that lacuna has been covered in the current law. That is one of the ground to apply Heyden's rule or mischief rule, and that is one of the ground to shift from the literal interpretation. Therefore, it is not really correct to say that the rule of Heyden's case is not applicable when the language is not ambiguous. The correct principle is that after the words have been constructed in that context and it is found that the language is capable of bearing only one construction, the rule of Heyden's case ceases to be controlling and give way to the plain rule. So it clearly says that when the language is ambiguous, go with the Heyden rules. When the language is not ambiguous, in that case also please see the purpose of the law and the language of the law, whether both matches. If yes, both matches, then we can say it is a literal rule of interpretation. But when there is an ambiguity, we can say it is a Heyden's rule of interpretation. Again, in a case of Ira versus State of Delhi, Apex Court has encouraged and clarified the understanding. Court propounded the theory of creative interpretation. A new interpretation was given, creative interpretation, following Heyden's rules and demarcated a Lakshman Rekha for this purpose. What Delhi High Court says, let's read the issue, that all this leads to whether judges do creatively interpret statutes and are unjustifiably criticized as having in fact legislated, or whether the guise of creative interpretation, they actually step outside the Lakshman Rekha. So here it is also mentioned that whether the interpretation given by the court is good, valid or not valid, whether there is a demarcation that which judges can be used for the interpretation of the statute. So in the case of Directorate of Enforcement versus Deepak Mahajan in Supreme Court, it was held that though the functioning of the court is only to expound the law and not to legislate, nonetheless the legislature cannot be asked to sit to resolve the difficulties in the interpretation of its intention and the spirit of the law. In some circumstances, it is the duty of the court to mount or creatively interpret the legislation by liberally interpreting the statutes. So it is not always duty of the court is to complicate the things or is to see the second version, but it is also the duty of the court to mount or creatively interpret the legislation by liberally interpreting the statutes. There are so many other judgments also where this literal rule and its exceptions have been explained. In one of the judgment in English court, it has been mentioned that to move away from the literal rule of interpretation back to the rule of Old English case of Heyden, as we've discussed, where the court must have recourse of the purpose. What is the recourse of the purpose? Objects, text, and context of the particular provision before arriving at a judicial result. So the court need to have the objects, text, and context. If they want to move from the literal rule, then in that case they need to see the object of the law, text, and the context of the law. In fact, the wheel has turned full cycle. So that in any case there cannot be any bad judgment. So that is one of the interpretation. Also in income tax, in one of the case in section 56, it has been specified in one of the ruling for section 56 under Income Tax Act, it has been mentioned that without prejudice to the provisions of subsection 1 of section 56 of Income Tax Act, if in the opinion of the income tax officer the fair market value of capital asset transferred by the assessee as on the date of transfer exceeds the full value of consideration declared by the assessee in respect of the transfer of such capital asset by an amount of not less than 15% of the value so declared, the full value of consideration of such capital asset shall, with the previous approval of the inspecting assistant commissioner, be taken to be its fair market value on the date of its transfer. So this is one of the case where income tax provision of fair market value in section 56 has been settled by the apex court in the case of KP Vagasi. In the case of KP Vagasi, that is one of the ruling which has been given, and the literal meaning of interpretation has been overruled by the Heyden'S rule. Also, in one more of the judgment, it has been specified that it is now a well settled rule of construction that where the plain literal interpretation of the statute provides plain literal interpretation of a statutory provision produces a manifestly absurd and unjust result, which could never have been intended by the legislature. The court may modify the language used by the legislature or even do some violence to it. So in case the language of law is very absurd, courts even can modify the language. So the court may also in such a case read into the statutory provisions a condition which through not expressed is implicit as construing the basic assumption underlying the statutory provisions. Also, let's see the example how to read a statute. So we will take an example. I will quote a section from Income Tax Act. Let's read section 56 to 7b of the Income Tax Act. Section 56 to 7b says that section 56 to 7b is not applicable where money is received by a resident from a non-resident. However, it get attracted when the resident further invests some money into another resident. Such situations are not hard to examine, as normally FDI comes into the main Indian holding company and then they used to invest the money in other subsidiaries. So let's take an example that X avails loan of rupees 100 from a bank and invested it further in shares of rupees 10 with a premium of rupees 90. A and B, husband and wife, are existing shareholders with 60-40 ratio. Both invests further in a company by acquiring fresh equity at huge premium. However, the shareholding remains same. Let's take other example of reading the literal interpretation, that bona fide investment in shares of a startup company which is running into losses and the valuation cannot be defended with DCF but is supported with market justifications. Let's take the last example, that whether section 56 to 10c will apply even in genuine cases, for example purchasing of painting at distress price from a seller which is urgently and desperately in need of the funds. So all these examples clearly says that law have given some language. Section 56, as we all know, it talks about gates, it talks about other valuations, that at what price we need to consider for the income tax act. Now if we again read these examples, we will find that if little interpretation have been given to section 56, then huge amount of tax need to be paid. However, there can be a genuine scenario where this language of section 56 need to be interpreted in purposive manner or golden rule or with Heyden'S principle. Let me just repeat a couple of examples again, that purchasing of a painting at a distressed price means at a lower price from a seller who urgently need funds and he want to sell it painting at a lower price also. Let's take a second example, that A and B have invested in a company with huge equity amount with premium and their shareholdings remains the same. Also, there can be a possibility that an Indian company who is subsidiary of foreign company got the fund from outside India and then further invested in its Indian subsidiaries. So what we have to do, what I want to say, that we have to interpret any language of the law firstly literally, and when the literal rule itself is not sufficient, when the literal rule is not giving a purposeful meaning, there is an ambiguity in the language of the law, then we can shift to the Heyden'S rules, golden rule, or any other interpretation rules. So friend, with this we conclude this video on literal rule of interpretation and few case laws from the Income Tax Act, where we discussed about how literal rule have not been followed and some other interpretation have been given by the law. In this video we have discussed literal rules along with the Heyden'S rules. If you have any query, you can comment on the video. Thank you friends.